In this video, we'll take a look at how to paint a realistic hamburger using opaque watercolor or gouache. We'll start by sketching the contour lines of our subject, which of course is a hamburger. We're just going to be drawing the contours or the outlines of the subject, no shading here at all. I'm working with an H graphite pencil on 140-pound cold-pressed watercolor paper. We'll gently erase the lines before moving on to applying the gouache. Now, gouache is opaque watercolor, and for this demonstration, I'm using two different brands of gouache. I'll be using the Winsor & Newton Designer's gouache with just primary colors, and I'll also be supplementing this with a few colors made by Reeves. Both brands work well for what we're trying to achieve in this painting. The Winsor & Newton line, of course, is considerably more expensive. So if you're on a budget, you can stick with the Reeves and still get the same quality of results. So let's go ahead and get started applying our first applications of gouache. We'll address each section of the hamburger completely before moving on to the next section. We're approaching this as a direct painting method. In other words, we're not creating a range of values underneath and then applying local color on top. Instead, we're going to create areas of local color and then push the value range, the lighter and darker values in each section. We'll start by mixing up a brown by mixing permanent green with the primary red, and then we'll add a bit of sienna to that color to get the base color for the bread. Then we'll just work on creating lighter values, as you can see here, in the areas that are on the lower portion of the top bun and the upper portion of the bottom bun. We'll also add just a slight indication of highlight on the top portion of the bun where the light source is originating from. Now, one of the great characteristics of gouache is we can just add a bit of water to areas where we've already applied paint, even if the paint is completely dry. This will reactivate that section, allowing us to create smoother transitions between values and colors. We'll progressively add a few more colors, this time with a little bit more of the burnt sienna in the mixture to create a little bit more interest in the color and bring it to a more natural look. As we apply each color, we'll continue to smooth out transitions of value and color by adding water. We'll also continue to work the lighter values that happen on the bottom portion of the top bun and the upper portion of the bottom bun. And then again, with a bit of water, we can smooth the transitions of value and color. Just like we continue to push the lighter values, we'll continue to push the darker values where there's a bit of shadow. And then again, as we add each area of value and color, we can ease the transitions of value with just a touch of water, reactivating the paint that we've already applied to the surface. Progressively, we'll get stronger with our highlights and make the value just a bit lighter. We'll add just an indication of some yellow, this time with a bit of yellow ochre in our base color mixture, and apply it to the top and bottom buns. It's important if you mix a color to use it in more than one area. This will create harmony and unity in your work. Now we'll make the shadows just a bit darker on the bottom portion of the bun. This time, a bit more of the dark brown that we mixed with the permanent green and the primary red is used here. We'll also strengthen the highlights on the top portion of the bun. This is really going to add to the illusion of it being realistic. And a few more textural marks are added to the lower portion of the bun. Now we can add those sesame seeds. Now, these sesame seeds are just basically painted on here freehand. I'm using just a touch of yellow ochre mixed with titanium white to create the initial shapes. Then I'm going back with a darker brown mixture to create just an indication of shadow. Of course, I'm using a very small brush here. This is a delicate process. Now, there's more than just a color and a shadow that's involved in the sesame seeds. We'll also go back again with a bit of water in the brush and pull some of the darker values into the sesame seeds, making them feel a little bit more like they're a form. And then we'll add a slight indication of a highlight as well using titanium white. Then, just like we did with the bun, we'll fill in the base color or the local color of the tomatoes. And in this case, I used a mixture of primary red with just a bit of the brilliant red from the Reeves set. Then, just like we did on the top and bottom portion of the hamburger buns, we'll go back and push the lighter and darker values. Again, just mixing darker versions of the red and lighter versions of the red. We can put them on with broad strokes initially and then go back with a bit of water in the brush and smooth the transitions of value and color. We'll also add a few indications of highlight here and there using titanium white and the small brush. Then we can add the layer of cheese, which is, of course, the most important part of the hamburger. I'm using a mixture of the primary yellow and the medium yellow from the Reeve set. With our base color in place, we can begin the process of pushing the values lighter and darker. This time we'll start with the darker values, and this is just a darker brown that we used earlier in the process. We'll add just shapes of these areas of value and then go back and smooth the transitions again by reactivating the paint with a bit of water. Now, of course, the highlights and lighter values are just as important, so we'll address these next. We'll add just a bit of titanium white to the base color that we created for the cheese and start developing some of the lighter values. These highlights may not seem that significant, and it may even seem strange adding them at this point in the painting, but you'll see in the end that these highlights are crucial to creating that illusion of realism that we're after. We'll go back at this point and we'll strengthen some of the darker values now that we have some of the highlights and some of the shadows in place. We'll also add a stronger shadow closer to the middle portion of the cheese. This is where part of the beef above it hangs over the top, creating an area of cast shadow. With a bit of water, we'll ease the transitions of value a bit further, and then it's time to address the beef. We'll start by adding our base color, and this time it's a darker version of brown. Again, we've mixed this brown by combining permanent green and primary red. And then we've darkened it slightly by adding just a bit of ivory black. Over the top, we'll add a semi-transparent application of burnt sienna. You'll notice that the brush strokes kind of follow an irregular pattern. We'll next add a bit of yellow ochre to this mixture and again follow the same pattern by creating these irregular brush strokes over the top. A bit of brilliant red is added to the mixture with just a touch of titanium white, and we'll continue this process with a variety of related colors. Now, we'll need to push some of the darker values that happen in the shadows as the hamburger recedes back underneath the tomato and above the cheese. So we'll mix quite a bit of ivory black with our base color that we mixed for the beef, and we'll start to develop some of those shadows. Here again, the areas of darker value are applied initially, and then we'll go back with a bit of water on the brush, reactivating areas and smoothing the transitions of color and value. Now, this is by far one of the most unique and awesome characteristics of working with gouache. It allows you to continue to work on the painting even after the paint has completely dried. You can't do this with acrylic paints, and you really can't do it with oils once they have dried either. We'll do the same thing on the bottom piece of beef underneath the cheese, again increasing the contrast by darkening up some of the values in the shadows, and then again smoothing those transitions with an application of water. Now, of course, the beef is going to have some highlights as well. So we're going to go back, this time with a bit of titanium white in our brown mixture. Now, it may look like this color that we're adding here is white, but it's actually not quite white. There is still a touch of yellow ochre in the mixture. We'll add quite a number of highlights, and then it's time to go back and put a few indications of some pepper mixed in with the beef. So we'll do that with the ivory black. Now, let's go ahead and move on to the lettuce. Or should I say, let us continue the painting. Here again, we'll add a base color first. Now, this base color is a mixture of the permanent green, a touch of leaf green from the Reeve set, and a bit of titanium white. Over the top, we're going to start to push some of the lighter values that exist there by adding a bit more of the primary yellow in the mixture. Then, just as we have in the other sections, we'll start to push the darker values, and this is where the lettuce is really going to start to develop its form. This darker version is created by adding just a bit more of the permanent green with just a slight touch of the ivory black. We're also going to make sure that we keep a little bit of yellow in the mixture so that we stick with the yellow-green and don't become too blue-green, which will make the lettuce appear unnatural. Now that we've developed some of the darker values, we'll go back and create some of the highlights. Most of the highlights happen around the edges of each one of the leaves of the lettuce. This highlight, you can see, is very heavily concentrated with our primary yellow. There's of course quite a bit of titanium white in the mixture as well to make the value light enough, but remember, it shouldn't be totally white. Now the process for developing the form of the lettuce on the bottom portion of the hamburger is of course exactly the same. We'll start by developing some of the darker values using a darker version of our green. Keep in mind that you don't need to include every single detail that you see in your reference. You just want to create the illusion of realistic lettuce. This just requires pushing the lighter and darker values and adding a few details here and there. If the shapes are a little bit different from what you're seeing, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. We'll continue to push the darker values so that we have a pretty good relationship of contrast. And then of course we'll go back with a bit of water and smooth the transitions between darker and lighter values. Now, here and there are a few veins that are visible in each one of the leaves of lettuce. So we'll add this with our darker version of green using the very small round brush. It's very easy to get too strong with these marks, so if you accidentally get a little too heavy or the value is a little too dark, remember you can always go back and clean things up a little bit with the addition of some water. And then of course, just as the darks are important, the lights are important as well. So we'll go back and add a few highlights here and there. Remember, this highlight that we're adding is not completely white. There is a bit of yellow mixed in as well. And keep in mind as well that a lot of these highlights exist around the edges of the lettuce leaves. Now let's push the values just a bit further. We'll go back and make the shadow a little bit stronger underneath the cheese on the bottom piece of beef. And then again, smooth out those transitions with a bit of water. We also need to tone down some of the highlights that are happening on the left side of the tomato. A little bit of water fixes this easily. We'll also clean up the highlight on the bottom portion of the tomato as well, as it's a little too strong. Again, a little bit of water fixes this quite easily. Now, at this point, our hamburger is floating, so let's add a little bit of cast shadow underneath. Now, since the hamburger is sitting on a flat surface with a very direct light overhead, the shadow will be very subtle, but again, very important. Now, it may appear that I'm adding black, but this is not quite black. This is actually the brown we used for the beef color, and a little bit of blue, and then just a touch of ivory black. We'll also add a bit of water to it and pull it out just a bit so that we create a little bit of gradation of value. Finally, we'll finish off the painting by enhancing the shadow underneath the lettuce on the left side of the hamburger bun. And now our realistic painting of a hamburger using opaque watercolor is complete. Remember, if you enjoyed this video, be sure that you subscribe or head over to thevirtualinstructor.com.